Hey guys, and welcome to part 2 of my journey of going from 2600 to 2700 plus in Crazyhouse on leechess.org. In the first part, I shared the journey from 2600 to 2650, and in the first game we'll see here, this was the first rated game that I played of Crazyhouse since breaking 2650, in a game with the black pieces against Senescent Cell. And, well, in this game, my opponent went knight c3, and then after g6, bishop g5. And I have to admit that this line where white plays very directly with bishop f6 and e4 is definitely one of the lines I've had the most trouble with in the past. For example, I used to play bishop g7, but then after bishop takes f6, pawn takes f6 and e4, well, white has this very straightforward plan for bullet of just piling everything on the dark squares. And okay, objectively it's not that great, but somehow I kept having problems dealing with this in practice. I mean, I'd sort of had looked at it briefly with the engine and knew, for example, that moves like bishop f5 are meant to be quite good, but they would kind of sack anyway with knight takes f6, and I would have some problems dealing with this. Okay, not really objective problems, because I mean, you can just play like queen back to some square. Let's say queen c6 actually is a really nice move that had not really occurred to me when playing these bullet games, but like after pawn f6, it's kind of instructive to note that, the bishop does have a safe square on h6, and, well, white's attack starts to come to a little bit of a close, like knight at g7 maybe looks nice, but you're slowly kind of running out of steam. Like even gf5, it's not obvious how white's going to really use the bishop in hand here. Also, bishop at a5 check is going to be annoying at some point, showing that black can also play on the dark squares and use the fact that white is rather lacking in good drops compared to black here. So that's a good way to defend, and perhaps something I will consider playing next time, to play this bishop g7 move order as well, just to keep my opponents guessing. But in this period of time where I got to 2700, I decided to play this move knight bd7 instead, as a way of avoiding this whole bishop takes f6 and e4 kind of idea. And I picked up this idea from Blitz Bullet, who played it against me many times when I tried to play something similar against him. Probably the best approach for white is just to play something like e3 and just develop normally, saying that also black's knight bd7 is slightly committal, though it's a step I was happy to play anyway, like bishop g7. You can play like castles, h6, c5 is a general plan that black is going for in such instances. Anyway, the game went bishop takes f6 directly, and my opponent played in a super aggressive fashion with knight at e5. And I have to admit that I hadn't really seen this idea before this game, but my opponent, Senescent Cell, had played it in a lot of games against me in this match. And yeah, this first game was one I think I admittedly didn't defend against this in the very best way, but I was able to still be very resilient, and you'll see that one of the key things that distinguished me getting the 2700 versus being stuck around 2600 was really my ability to defend against these sorts of attacks, like knight e5. Okay, apparently king g8 is even a better square, saying that pawn at f7 is a little bit of a harmless drop in reality. But I went king to f8 instead, because it just felt right to me somehow. And after e3, I decided to focus on defense, playing moves like bishop at e8, followed by bishop to e6, perhaps anticipating some drops on the light squares. But I also could actually play a lot more aggressively, and it's kind of instructive to note that a move like bishop at b4 is actually really strong, where with this pin you just have ideas like putting a knight on e4, even dropping a knight to e4 as well, or dropping a knight to a4, and we see that white is simply too weak on those dark squares. The best move apparently is pawn at d2, but if you have to drop pawns in second rank like this, it's a sign that this didn't really work out and that white is rather lacking in compensation. Either c5 or bishop d6 and killing the knight is probably the most practical way to deal with this attack and consolidate the extra piece. But yeah, I played a little bit passively. This was also the first rated game I'd played, and while I'd played a lot of unrated games kind of testing different openings, of course it's a little different when you're actually playing a rated game, and h4 objectively it's probably not that great, but in a bullet game the idea of trying to open up or play on those dark squares is quite a serious concept. And actually, one thing I had forgotten from my old study is that in these sort of middle games, a quite thematic idea is actually to play the move c5. I kind of sack the pawn, but also open up the center. And later on, I did come across this idea in some different positions where it's worth sacking the pawn to be able to take control of the game. But As it was, I played knight h5, kind of not really knowing what else to do. Like, I sort of felt that this was a bad move, but I just couldn't really come up with anything else. And I also remembered, like, that I was generally a faster player than my opponent, so I wanted to put some pressure on his clock in this way. But if he just plays, like, g4, I mean, I just lose a couple of tempi, like g5, pawn h6 is really quite bad for me. But he goes pawn at g4, which is kind of a very common mistake I notice actually among many Crazyhouse players, is they will sometimes play with superfluous pieces. And what I mean is that you don't really need the pawn on g2 because black is not attacking the white king. So why not just use it directly instead of dropping a pawn? And here you kind of wish you had that pawn in hand for g5 and h6. And still here g5 is a very strong move actually, but he went h5 instead. And yeah, here my response wasn't that good. I should just take the pawn and, not fear anything like g takes h5, because, well, I mean, he has a threat of pawn h6, but, a move like pawn at h3 is a very typical way to deal with this, which I have to admit I often forget about, but after, analyzing some of the positions sort of after this game, it sort of helped me to kind of see these ideas a little more automatically, but, in a heated battle, it's possible to forget this, I suppose. Anyway, the game went pawn to g5, and yeah, this is true that technically white is winning here. But you'll notice from this point I do a pretty good job at defending, like pawn at g7. Also like knight f7, I'm putting the pieces around the king and making it as slow as possible for him to actually convert this. And that kind of paid off because he started to get rather low on time actually from the next few moves. Where he started to spend a lot of time, I think, looking for a kind of forced win rather than just playing natural moves. And yeah, rook c8 is very provocative. Like, obviously, my light squares are very weak despite having two bishops there. But rook c8 is also trying to create some counterplay with c5, which could be a bit unpleasant for him when he gets really low on the clock. Bishop at g6 is a very good move, using that pin on the h file. And I figured I can't really defend against this easily, so I'm just going to put the pieces I have in hand on the board and at least drag the game for as long as possible. So c5, and I was a little bit surprised in the game they didn't take and get that extra pawn in hand to put on the light squares, but because I mean it makes sense why I go for a light squared strategy here. But yeah, instead he goes for pawn at g6, which I mean is also winning, but suddenly what he kind of realized is that, the pawn looks really nice on f7, and, it is true this is completely winning. But it's actually not so easy to finish black off quickly. Okay, if you had an increment, it wouldn't matter so much, but when it's a flat 1 minute, he kind of needs something a bit direct or he's just going to lose on time. I mean, actually, it says he was down to at 30 seconds here. So, yeah, I mean, he should have had enough time in reality. But, yeah, knight g4 again, the kind of move you play, sort of saying, well, I'm going to try to provoke you into taking and say that you aren't able to find the mate. So you can see I'm sort of seeing some little problems with the way I'm playing. Knight d5 is actually quite a nice move to get the pawn in hand for pawn at h6, but I think his follow-up of queen takes g4 is probably a blunder, and I think he miscalculated and maybe thought he had a checkmate here. When actually the best approach is to kind of build up more slowly, or if you are going to do is just play like pawn at h6, and if you get the knight in hand, I mean, obviously black can try to do things as well, but having like that knight at c5 or a knight at h5, you can definitely try to set some problems. Actually, computer thinks that even here, like, you can play bishop g2, drop something f6, and that somehow black is surviving, which, from a human perspective, seems a bit surprising, but I suppose it is true that I have a lot more piece in hand to drop to defend than he has to attack me. So maybe the best bet is actually to play e4 and try to sort of exchange some material for the attack, but yeah, this is a very good example of position that initially the computer thinks is winning, but when you play it out, probably black is actually doing okay. And this is because I exploit his tendency, thinking, well, I just need to sack a few pieces and then I'll get material for mate. But actually, my king proves surprisingly safe here. And yeah, his attempt to go for this just doesn't work, where he forgot that I can also counterattack, and, well, it was mate in 5 with pawn at d2. King f1 we can take here, and after king d2, knight at c4, pawn at d2, and yeah, I just do a very standard smothered force mate with knight d2 checkmate. So yeah, this was a bit of a swindle. Admittedly, he didn't play a very good opening, but it's a little bit tricky to defend it in bullet. I didn't defend it in the best way, like I wasted time with the knight and this sort of thing. But I was able to kind of pull it together and sort of continue to find the best defensive moves even after messing it up. Which is something I wasn't doing a very good job of back when I was playing Crazyhouse in 2021. Anyway, let's see the next game. Because I actually played a lot of games against this Senescent Cell guy. That's also one thing I kind of implied in the first part, but it's worth saying explicitly that in the past, if I won a couple of good games, I would kind of stop playing and like, oh, I just want to protect my rating and protect the games. Whereas the big shift I made is I sort of really believed in the power of momentum, and I still do believe, of course, in the power of momentum. That if you're winning and you're beating a guy a few times in a row, it also kind of means that like a lot of them they psychologically get discouraged or they stop playing their best lines or start getting kind of desperate. And I was kind of using that to my advantage, knowing it, okay, I'm already beating these guys, so I can just play the same way or a very similar way in each game and let them try to figure out how to deal with it. And that was a big shift in my approach. It allowed me to have some quite nice streaks against some quite decent players where I would just gain like 30 to 40 rating points into one match sometimes. And so this game came from quite late in the session. At this stage, I'd already gained like 41 points against this guy. Well, I think it was 41 points including this win. So I stuck with what I was playing against him nearly every time, just playing, the standard Catalan style setup. Of course, F3 is a pretty normal move in these positions, stopping any pawn at H3 drops in the future. So he had castles, and yeah, bishop d7 is a very interesting idea on his part. Though I think that going queen d7 and trying to go for queen takes h3 maybe is a better version. But this is, perhaps a little bit of another story. Like, computer likes ideas of going like queen h5 and this sort of thing, but it is a little bit computer-esque somehow. I don't think most people would think of this if you didn't have the engine turned on, as it were. But okay, he went bishop d7. King h2 just a prophylaxis against the queen c8 move that he played. And yeah, probably knight c3 is the best move here. Just, develop and go for like bishop g5, knight e5, and use the fact his pawn on d5 is not so well defended to pressure it. And that would probably give me a nice advantage where I could try to pile on his weak dark squares. But I went for knight e5 as a kind of practical decision. I just wanted to trade off his bishop at some point so he wouldn't have some like queen sack where he could attack my weak light squares. So kind of prioritizing a king safety, which is, one of my, let's say, principles when playing these rated 1 minute games. Probably his best bet is actually just to move the bishop and say that my knight maybe is not ideal on e5, but he wasn't willing to lose a tempo, and that's part of what cost him, I think. Like, knight c3 goes knight c6, and I actually think, I'm very proud of the move I played here of knight takes d7, because the computer says that quite a few moves are quite similar in value. This is the Indian stockfish. For instance, it kind of likes that idea of, recycling the knight and going knight to e5, as it were. But knight d7 I like because it just makes my king very, very safe. Okay, knight to g4 is maybe an idea, so I play bishop to f3 to cover it. Again, objectively not the best move, but practically just makes it very hard for him to attack me. And I knew from kind of playing him that he was a sort of player that if you just kind of kept playing solid moves, he would really struggle to come up with a good plan. And I can then just outplay him more easily. Like, the best bet for black is probably to go rook d8. And it's saying an instructive point that you actually don't really want to take on d5. Because if you take, what happens is you get a position, and it's pretty standard, by the way, for the d4 openings, where the 2 minor pieces in hand, or actually 4 minor piece hand for black, are worth much more than the queen and knight. My light squares are going to be very weak once he puts a bishop on the diagonal, sacks h3, there's going to be problems. So it's much better just to keep the tension and just kind of play it out more normally. Well, after knight at e4, again, a little superfluous to put the knight here, but I can understand the logic. It just doesn't really work that well. And bishop f4 is kind of saying, well, I'll let you make the exchanges, and it's kind of a well-known point in Crazyhouse that double pawns aren't really a weakness because of how versatile the structure can be. The computer points out a really nice idea of playing like c4 and trying to deflect the pawn away to win the knights, but I think it's a little impractical. Things like take and e4, I feel like your king is starting getting a bit open as white, and that's something I would generally prefer to avoid if I can help it, especially with not a lot of time to defend. Knight at e5 would be an interesting idea, but queen e1 is a move I think that for this sort of practical situation is fairly sensible. Like, just defend against the drops on the dark squares that are very likely to come in a bullet game, defend your pawn, and sort of ask black, okay, what's your plan here? Because it's very hard for black, I find, to actually come up with a good plan. It isn't, let's say, trying to attack the king somehow, but it's very hard to do this. Like, maybe g5 and, try to get a pawn on g4 and get at the light squares that way, but that's a very committal decision to make with not a lot of time on the clock. So he played king h7. He decided to play quite slowly, and I sort of had this feeling that in a position like this, that maybe I don't have an immediate crushing continuation, but I wasn't really sure what he should really do at this point. So I decided to follow this policy, just kind of playing slowly, just slowly improving the position and kind of waiting for my opportunity, and also just building that time advantage on the clock. Because he spent like a minute, like 1.5 seconds on rook fe8, and okay, a4 was a move I played, so I just wasn't sure what to do, but it isn't a particularly great move. Probably this is actually a good moment to go bishop takes e4 and put a knight on c5, and that way I can sort of go after this weakness, and that would actually be really strong here. I think I just automatically rejected bishop e4 because I was worried that maybe at some point he drops on f3 and my light squares get weak. But given that queen d5 is running to bishop c7 and or even knight at e3, if I just want to focus on safety first, then it's not really anything objectively to worry about. But okay, a4 unfortunately doesn't throw away all the advantage. Still, I have a very pleasant position. Okay, I didn't see bishop take c7 until just after I moved, and then he corrected the mistake. And yeah, you can sort of see here I was really struggling to come up with a good plan. I mean, it was a long match, a lot of things were happening. But I figured, okay, e3 is probably not a bad move in the sense of, making sure the bishop is overprotected. But okay, it's true, there were better moves, of course, like, again, bishop e4, knight c5 is still an idea. That would be quite strong. But anyway, e3, e6. I went bishop e5 again, kind of not really knowing what to do in this position. But figuring at least if I can create some tension and maybe try and encourage some bad exchange, it would be nice. Turns actually 95 is quite a good exchange, but it's sort of for more strategic reasons in the sense that you actually are quite happy to give up the piece in order to kind of weaken white and have the pawn on hand for pawn at e4 and playing on the light squares. So that's quite an instructive point that actually is quite happy to get the bishop in hand for his play. Because also this is where I really wish the pawn would be on e2. To say if e4 I could take, e takes f3 and keep the king safe. And I was kind of aware of that when I played e3, but I just wasn't really sure what else to do, honestly. And luckily my opponent wasn't either. After rook b1, queen e7. I mean, this is definitely not the best game I played, but I played bishop f6 figuring, okay, otherwise why'd I play bishop e5? And yeah, it was lucky for me that he didn't see the obvious knight f6 and black is just better. In this case, he would probably almost be outplaying me because I sort of didn't really find the right moment to transform the position with bishop e4, knight c5. But it's definitely an idea I'll remember for next time when I combine queen d7 and knight e4. But he goes bishop f6 and I kind of get rewarded for suddenly shifting the pace of the play. Because I don't think he expected me to go for the exchange. He expected me just to keep maneuvering. And because he didn't adapt immediately, I was able to catch him out in a sense. And well, after bishop to g2, it's probably not a very good move. I should probably just play bishop f5, ef5, and I think I was nervous about these dark squares, these light squares getting weak, but turns out I can actually just attack him first, and that's not something I realized at the time in the game. I mean, even like practically, like I would be a little nervous that maybe my king is a bit weak for knight f3, but computer says you just go f3 and it just doesn't really work out for black. But it's something that would make me a little bit worried in practice because, well, like I guess I have a lot more drops than black, which does help here. In any case, we had bishop g2, and yeah, bishop e4 is a good move, and I kind of realized I'd screwed up a little bit, but I thought, okay, let's just play pawn f3, just focus on defense and say, okay, you can take d3 and you get some material, but at least I keep my king safe, and maybe I go bishop at e4 at some point, and even try to drop something against these squares. Actually, probably knight at d2 is really strong. Actually, I think I remember calculating something like this, where I decided that I would be actually quite happy to sacrifice the second exchange to have the material to attack on the light squares. And, computer is even saying you can even sack the queen at this point, actually. And then if black were to take the queen, that actually this position is probably quite good for white. In fact, you can drop like bishop at c5, knight at h5, and somehow it's not that easy for black to cover the squares with the heavy pieces. Like the minor pieces can be better than the heavy ones in this position. So that's kind of an interesting point, but instead goes knight g5, and yeah, once he sort of misses that opportunity to grab some material back, it's just kind of losing. He just has too many weaknesses, and okay, knight f4 is kind of a bit silly. Knight at e4 is so much better to, start collecting material, but okay, knight f4, he missed a chance to go e5, which is what I was expecting, and yeah, after h5 just focused on defense, and okay, probably this is objectively not very good play by me, but yeah, here I start to realize, okay, my king is very, very safe. There's no way he's getting through. So let's now focus on attack. And my original idea was to play h4 and win the knight, which is actually the top choice of the engine, but now I actually like the move e4 better because it keeps my king a lot safer. And yeah, his attempts to try to get my king just didn't really work. I mean, it might be very tempting just to try to play for mate at this point. Computer is saying, for example, that this queen sack is apparently just crushing, saying that, black is a bit too weak on those dark squares. But queen e2 is kind of safety first, saying, okay, I have like 10 more seconds than him on the clock, and if I just keep everything safe, there's no way he's getting through. And you can sort of see here, okay, I could have calculated whether bishop at f6 is mate, but I was lazy and said, let's just grab the material and just say his attack comes to an end. And yeah, he just doesn't have a good drop on me at this point. So yeah, well, it's probably surely some line where I can just force mate. I thought, let's just keep the initiative and just, not give him any sort of hope. Bishop f6, and yeah, I just played. Okay, it turns out I have rook h8 mate, but I think I pre-moved e takes f5 because I was getting I had 15 seconds to his 1, but yeah, he lost on time anyway at this stage. And well, he still can't really avoid mate, to be honest. So it's quite a fun game. I think quite a convincing win, despite a couple of mistakes on my end. And it shows how you don't have to really go crazy necessarily to beat these players, but you can just sort of just suddenly improve the position. And as long as you avoid making any big tactical blunders and you kind of punish the opponents like big tactical blunders yourself, there's a very good chance you're going to win, especially at this time control. Hopefully a more strategic approach than what I used to follow. So let's see the next game. When I was playing with the black pieces against the blue, so I was rated 2-5-1-2 and I was rated 2-6-7-4 at the time of this game. I forgot to say before, if you are enjoying this video, do leave a like and yeah, definitely subscribe for more of the videos like this. So this game I was playing with black, and you'll see already a little bit of a shift where instead of just playing knight 6 g6 every game, I've done this before against this guy a couple of times, but then I was running into some problems where he was going bishop g5 and I was going for this line like just sacking on f7, kind of like we saw Senescent Cell play against me as well. And yeah, objectively it's not very good, but it was sort of a line where I was feeling a bit uncomfortable. I also tried avoiding it with h6, but then he kind of was playing bishop f4 and kind of going for this same idea anyway, which, to be fair, is actually a little bit annoying. That let's say if we have bishop f6 like this, e4 is maybe in a better version actually when the pawn is on h6, because it means that, let's say if I go bishop f5, I had a game actually, I think against him where he beat me, where he went like knight f6 and e5, and I kind of was like really worried because like, oh, I don't have bishop at h6 anymore because the pawn is on h6. So it was actually kind of clever on white's part, although it's true that computer doesn't really care and says queen c6, black is still winning because, pawn f6. You still have got moves like bishop at a5 and, c3, knight at c2, and yeah, or actually c3, bishop c3 is kind of the real reason, and then put the knight on c2 at a good moment. So okay, with the benefit of hindsight, we can say that, black's attack is kind of faster, and, making him drop the knight means there's no knight g7. So it's something for me to remember the next time I play against these guys, so I can, play to move h6, the one thing I line that I think both Blitzbullet and Katask have used as a surprise weapon, just avoiding the bishop g5 lines. Well, to be fair, even bishop g5 is a p-sack. Well, I know that in some cases it's actually playable to even play it as a sack, but as long as you remember, like, bishop h4 and attacking this way, it's never really going to be a problem, quite frankly. In any case, since I hadn't really resolved this problem at the time of the game, I decided to play knight c6 and revert to a Jasugi system that I kind of had looked at a little bit before this game. Just very, very briefly. Probably the best way for white to play is to go h3 and just transition back into some g3 setup is probably the way I would play it as white. Computer doesn't think it's all that great because computer often underestimates this fianchetto setup for both sides, in fact. But I think that you could also say like the bishop is not really ideal on h5, that you'd probably prefer it on f5 in some respects against this particular setup, to support knight e4 and this kind of thing. I suppose the other way to play is like you go g4 and maybe this is the very best way actually. Just go bishop g2 and not really be afraid of the move h5, kind of saying, well, we just go g5 and okay, black does have ideas. I mean, it's still very much a playable position and one I'd be quite happy to play as black, but yeah, that's probably the best way of playing is bishop g4, like h3 and try to actually punish the move rather than playing sort of a bit casually as white did. Now, to be fair, bishop g5 may not such a bad move. But, okay, it's also true that I was feeling reasonably comfortable in the position. Okay, apparently f6 is quite bad because white can actually sack the bishop, not with e3, but with e4, which actually is something I didn't really know beforehand, so it's why it's good to look at your wins as well to, understand these ideas, like, for example, taking and, letting the pawn get to f7 would just be really quite horrible for black, king f7, knight g5 sort of stuff. So, yeah, basically, okay, I know that for next time that this move order probably isn't so great against a prepared opponent, but in bullet, where they're going to automatically retreat the bishop, I was sort of able to get away with it, such that this position is actually very decent for black. Actually, probably to move knight h6 is a little more precise than my bishop d6 for reasons that we'll see in the game, and again, it's something for me to learn for next time. Because after bishop d6, bishop e2, yeah, I was actually expecting him to go bishop b5. I felt like it'd be more critical to try to at least get a knight in hand at some point, but he decided to break the pin, and yeah, next time I'd definitely go knight h6. Actually, I kind of had this feeling during the game that maybe knight h6 is better, because by this stage I'd had a few games where people had played like this bishop f6 pawn at e5 idea against me. But, yeah, well, I guess now I know to sort of trust my intuition on it rather than just following this just because it's the sap that I had learned. Actually, the sap I learned was with bishop f5 rather than bishop g4, but, it's a similar idea that you're trying to kind of take away good squares from the white pieces with the pawns. But yeah, bishop f6 I think is the best move, and, pawn at c5 is another way to try to get back the bishop, but my opponents always seem to go e5 against me, and here it's probably a little bit of a bluff, but I think I also may have misremembered the ideas, because I think the line I remember is where the bishop is on f5, actually, and in that position, castling is actually the best move. So I think I might have, confused my lines a little bit, otherwise I probably would have played bishop f3 and then taken on e5, or, win after which white would have nothing, so white should really take himself, but it turns out that the black king is actually very safe, probably safer than the white king, in fact, because black has still got those two pawns in hand, which means that, for example, you could put the pawn h3 and not give him an easy jump into the dark squares. I mean, black has ideas as well, like bishop at d6, going after h2 is one concept. I can always castle long if things get a bit gnarly on the king side. So I think that, this is going to be just very, very good for black. But I kind of mixed up my lines with castles, and yeah, ef6, rook f6, e pawn e5 is definitely, like, on a practical level, very difficult to defend. And, well, I didn't really defend it in the right way in the game. Actually, I sort of, as soon as I made this move, knight f5, I realized that a much better version of the piece stack idea would be to go knight g6 and, kind of play it this way. Although even this line has its problems, like, he's able to recycle a lot of material very quickly and, basically get a lot of material to open up my king. Which is probably why I think if I had this position again, I would either just sacrifice the rook with this just to get some stability in the structure once more. Also, it helps a lot he doesn't have, like, rook g3. That's really nice here. Or maybe the best option is just to kind of let them sort of take the bishop. Now, he doesn't necessarily have to take. I mean, maybe you want to go knight g5 and try to attack in this way. It's definitely a very messy position, one I think is much easier for white to play in the bullet time control. Which is sort of why, castles was just kind of way too ambitious. After knight f5, what I completely overlooked is that he just goes rook g5 and can just win my bishop. But I figured if he grabs my bishop, I don't really have any, I think, realistic chance to save the game. Like, say if we have this position, I mean, I'm just down, well, basically I'm just down like a bishop. Actually, no, I'm just down a rook, in fact, if we count the material, like, as it were, with no real compensation. So I realized that my best practical chance was basically to go queen takes, and then I realized that the queen f7 mate is a threat, but okay, I realized how to try to create some sort of imbalance, and you can see moves like knight e3 are just trying to make things as chaotic as possible. I mean, honestly, you should probably just take the knight, because even though I can play moves like bishop takes e6 or something like this, I mean, he does also have some very fast jumps in, like, knight h6, queen f6, and I mean, this shouldn't be, I think, too difficult for white to win in this case, because it's up a lot of material. But yeah, knight g7, like, even though it's technically winning as well, it does give some hope that I can at least try to defend my king a bit better now. And again, probably bishop g7's the best, but I just thought it would be too easy for him to attack my king, so I just decided to play very much in sort of swindle mode, just trying to make things as chaotic as possible. And I don't really have anything here, but somehow I was able to just completely fluke a win at this stage. Like here, for example, I thought he might put a queen on e6. I mean, bishop e6 is surely also winning, but you can see that from here I start to focus on just trying to keep my king safe and just drag the game out. At this stage, we both have about 30 seconds. He goes rook at d7. I mean, I think if he just plays like even knight takes d5, which is not even just to take the pawn, but just stop any knights at c4 counterplay. I mean, his king is very safe at this point. He's just going to drop stuff on my dark squares or even on my light squares. Some bishop takes at some point. And I think he should win that very easily from there. Instead, rook at d7 kind of gave me a little bit of a glimmer of hope that, okay, he's starting to maybe not pick the best ways to play it. And, okay, knight e5 is not the best move. Knight at c4 is apparently better. But I was probably a little bit nervous I was somehow getting made, and I just want to try to get a bit of material in hand. So he goes queen d8 again. I was quite happy to see this. I mean, I kind of knew intuitively this has got to be winning for white still. But at least, I mean, I've got a queen. Like, I can maybe try to do something knight c4, pawn at d2. So he goes knight here, and yeah, this moment, okay, bishop g5 was sort of a stall move, trying to slow things down. Computer says I should actually play queen at d4 and use that pin, which, I have to admit, didn't occur to me in the game. I did see the idea of playing queen at a5, but I thought he just goes like knight at c3 and there's nothing. Which actually is not so true, because then I had forgotten he doesn't have the knight to drop on e7 to threaten mate anymore. So that would actually be winning, and that would actually have been a really clever trap. But okay, after bishop g5, he plays pawn at f6. Computer is saying, yeah, that pawn f6 is just winning, and yeah, a big difference now is that, well, basically his play is a lot faster, and yeah, I was very surprised actually after this move after queen takes e5, because I thought it would just be very practical to just go knight at e7. I can't take this way, or go king h8 because of rook g8 mate. And say, well, okay, I'm just going to grab the queen. Actually, probably it's even better to go f takes e7 and get that extra bishop in hand, and then take the queen. And yeah, I could try moves like pawn at c3, try go after the king, but realistically, his king is actually pretty safe, because I only have pawns and knights. It's not like I have any rooks or queens to drop. And, something like bishop at d4, I feel like it should be winning for white with correct play. But okay, I can understand why he might be a little bit nervous about giving up the initiative, even with a lot of pieces still in hand. But that's what he should have done, I think. I mean, actually, computer is saying his move, bishop f7, is the most winning one, but it forces white to be very precise. Here, like, if you make one mistake, I think black is going to be the one who wins. So I was quite happy to see this. Like, apparently the move pawn at e7 is what white has to play, but I can sort of understand why he'd be nervous about something like pawn at d2 drops, and it's that maybe it's not just an objective thing, like that white made a practical mistake, but maybe it's an objective mistake as well. I mean, during game I did see the idea of going knight f4 and trying to grab his rook, which apparently is not that good here, but at least I saw the tactical possibility. But actually, bishop at a3 is really nice. If I can just throw everything at his king, and believe it or not, black probably has enough counterplay actually to survive this, which is kind of crazy, but it also shows what happens when you drop a lot of pieces on squares that are maybe, let's say, not helping that much for the attack immediately. Yeah, the speed of the attack really matters, and they kind of shown the game as well, like rook takes f8 is basically just a blunder. Maybe he missed pawn at d2 or he missed bishop f8, it's hard to say. I mean, you don't really need to calculate to see that queen d2 is going to run into a mate. But yeah, now I'm just perfectly safe, and okay, now we get this crazy time scramble. He has 5 seconds, I have 7, which is definitely quite nice here. And so I just start playing moves like just to kind of play everything with a tempo. Okay, I should have just put like something on c2, like rook c2 as a pre-move or something, but anyway, I decided to go bishop at f4, just kind of trying to anticipate any sort of attacks. And yeah, this is just kind of like time scramble madness. I started pre-moving to anticipate the checks he would make against my king, and I start just running with the king. So if, let's say, he plays, I don't know, pawn at e4, at least I have this pre-move and I can try to get away and not give any easy drops. But anyway, as it was, I did play a bit faster than him, and it was enough to win the game. So yeah, that was this game here, and there are just 2 more I would like to share with you as well, which were the 2 games that really... Well, actually, these were the last 2 games I played. Well, one of them was the game I played that got me to 2700 officially for the first time. Then the other one was one I played as my first game when I got to 2700 plus as a rated game. So this one I was playing also with the black pieces. You'll see I included more black games because it's kind of easier, I think, to be successful with white. Like, let's say if you're just like 2 600 level in Crazyhouse, you have a decent chance of him being like a 2 700, 2 800 player with the white pieces, like just because of, the fact that, well, you have this big advantage at the start in a way. So I find it's more interesting to actually look at the games with the black pieces and see how you kind of mitigate the initial disadvantage and still find the way to set the practical problems. Now, this game was actually against a FIDE master, Avada Kedavra. Nice reference to Harry Potter there. And actually, he was an opponent who used to be quite a difficult one for me. So I think it was a big psychological breakthrough for me to realize that, well, okay, just because he beat me a couple of times before, I'm still going to play him. And I was able to more than make up the score. Beating him, I think, like 6 or 7 times in a row. I kind of lost count, honestly. But yeah, I just kept beating him game after game. And that's essentially what got me to that 2 700 plus level. Also, because I kind of knew a bit of a weakness in his repertoire. Like, here you've got to go knight g5, I think, if you want to fight for an advantage as white. And yeah, it's kind of an interesting point that probably bishop d4 is not the best move for white, but it's what most people play here. So that's kind of good news if you're playing as black. Like, I think a move like f4 is probably a lot more critical, just trying to open up the f file for the attack. And I mean, I guess moves like knight g4 can be played, but that has its own big body of theory that perhaps falls outside the scope of this video. But I knew my opponent played h3, and this is a sort of move that I think if you're playing like below 2 300, you're going to face this move a lot, because they're not so ready to face bishop e7. Like, I remember actually when I was starting out in Crazyhouse, I had no real idea how to face bishop e7 myself. At the time, Gary's just a bit more of a high-level move, and I kind of noticed, like, I knew that the typical, like, bishop g5, knight d5 don't really work with a bishop on e7, but I didn't really know more than that until I actually started studying these openings seriously. It's kind of funny because the bishop e7 was, and also, like, 1 knight 6 was kind of, and d5, that was kind of the big reasons I sort of moved from e4 to 1 d4, playing it as white mostly. But anyway, this aside, after h3, I think it's kind of instructive to know what the move is here for black, and, well, if you want, you can try to figure out for yourself what is the correct plan for black when white plays a quiet move like this. Now, this is a funny situation where the move I would play in normal classical chess is actually the same as the move I played here in Crazyhouse. The key move is knight a5. And yeah, the idea is, of course, to take the bishop, but it actually goes a little bit deeper than that. Probably the best reply for white is to go takes and some like knight g5 sort of thing, as I think it was OK who you talked about this idea in one of his streams at some point. I think it was in reference to one of my games, funnily enough. But I knew my opponent liked to go bishop e5, b5. And I was quite lucky, actually, but not long before this game, I had actually come across a quite nice study by, I've forgotten the guy's name, Sicarius Noctis, where he actually shared like this sort of quite instructive point in that study. And okay, of course, given that his rating is like, 2-1, like in the high 2-100s, it sort of makes sense. I knew nearly everything in the study, but there were still a few good reminders of certain points I'd kind of forgotten previously. And one such point was that after b5, bishop to b3, I decided not to play bishop takes, knight takes b3 immediately. I'd kind of done this in the previous game against the guy and struggled a little bit. Though, okay, it turns out that probably this is actually objectively the best way to play, going for a sack on h3. But I also realized that my opponent is one of these players who didn't really have much of a feel for dynamics. He would just try to play super solidly and sort of wait for the opponent to do something reckless. So I thought, okay, let's go c6 and just wait for him to kind of play his sort of passive move. And okay, he played a move knight e2, which actually is not such a bad idea in general, but I think that, maybe pawn at d4 might be another attempt. But okay, pawn d4 is probably nervous I'll drop something on g4 and try to attack. But he can also try to drop something on h6, so it's not so easy, let's say. But okay, after knight e2, take, well, I was able to execute my idea of, bishop at e6, and yeah, it kind of totally shocked me that he didn't even make an attempt to stop the sack on h3, because I think any experienced Crazyhouse player would realize that the 2 pawns are much more important than the bishop because of the king safety factor. And so, you've got to play like knight g5 for better or worse here and try to get rid of the bishop. Fair enough, even here, actually, I could probably still sack if I really want to. Because, I end up getting the material back and his king gets very weak, so it's kind of instructive that even this doesn't really stop the idea, but at least it stops it being, like, completely winning for black. Because after knight g3, I think that, white is just strategically lost, that his king is way too exposed, so he's not going to have the capacity to use those pieces in hand. And yeah, after this, this is all just very standard Crazyhouse stuff, like pawn at g4, pawn at f3. Okay, bishop at f3 is apparently even better, but my move also does the trick. And I was certain he was going to play king h2, and, black is, of course, winning. I mean, I can play moves like, let's say, d5 to get the pawn in hand, or even bishop at f4 is another idea. Again, trying to facilitate exchanges that, with my king being a lot safer, will be in my favor. But instead he goes knight f3, and it kind of shocked me that he didn't realize, the queen x f3, knight h4 is, he just didn't see this fork. But okay, it's also true when I started playing Crazyhouse, I would often forget about these forks as well. That I would forget that, I literally just gave them the knight in hand when knight takes f3. But now these things come in more automatically to me. Also, of course, king f3, bishop at g4 was also not an option for white. But yeah, basically this is just over. And he resigned rather than making me play out the obvious knight h4, something on g2, something on h3, forced mate. So, yeah, that was a fun little game. And I have one more that I would like to share. And I think it goes to show, that actually I find it to beat these sort of players. I used to kind of overthink it, or I would sort of get really stressed thinking, how do I beat these guys? But it's actually just a matter of just doing the simple stuff well. As I have found for over the board play, it actually rings true for Crazyhouse also. So the final game I'll share with you was a game I played against Jeremy Durham. And most of the time when I get some new rating milestone in the past, I would just kind of stop and sit on it for a while. Admittedly, I did do that with a 2-6-50 but that was because I realized there was still a lot of gaps in my openings I need to really hone. But I also felt like, hey, I'm winning so many games in a row, let's play a couple more just to show that, it's not a fluke and that I am, playing even above this level. So this game against Jeremy Durham, he's rated 2452 at the time of the game, and nowadays I think he's more like high 2400s. But anyway, I stuck to my setup. I'd played him a lot of times and played this up very successfully against him. I mean, it's a big thing as well, when I was playing over the board chess, playing professional chess, I was kind of playing a different opening almost every game, and being very afraid of the opponent's preparation or just getting bored playing the same thing. But Crazyhouse, because you have a lot of drops on the board, every game is going to be different as such. And so it means it's much easier to kind of play the same stuff and still keep it interesting in that way. Sometimes my opponent had gone for a 97 f5 setup before, but then he kind of lost when I went for an e4 plan in reply. So he plays the correct knight f6, and, we have a pretty normal stuff. I mean, this is what he normally does with the white pieces anyway, playing this setup, so it wasn't that big of a shock. Actually, it's an interesting question whether knight c3 is the best move, or whether maybe I should play bishop f4, but anyway, knight c3 is kind of the normal developing move here. Kind of interesting that Stockfish wants to go b6 and bishop b7, because that seems like a bit of a weird placement for the bishop, but, maybe it's not as bad as I would think at first. But yeah, it's not the most human move in the position somehow. Even if it does maybe improve the bishop, but otherwise a little bit stuck in the structure. But anyway, after h6, actually I was kind of happy to see h6, there's nothing ridiculously wrong with the move, but I was already saying to eye up potential sacks on h6 in a way. So he goes 94, and okay, 94 is actually kind of a serious mistake, but I think I was being a little bit cautious. Now I think I would just take and, realize that actually black doesn't have a good drop on my king side, so I played a little too cautiously, but the move 95 immediately is still, I think, very nice for white. I mean, his structure, it's not as good as him having a doubled pawn, but, my position is still very solid, and I was definitely expecting to go knight h5 and try to, weaken me on the dark squares, because I think that's the only chance for black at this point. If you don't weaken white on the dark squares soon, I think that these weaknesses on the light or dark squares are really going to cost black with the fact this h6 move. It's a subtle weakness, but it really did create a lot of holes in the camp. In fact, maybe a move like knight g6 and trying to cover him with the pawns might be the best attempt to defend, but I still would much prefer to be white. So after knight at e4, yeah, I could actually just go knight e4 and just go directly for the attack and just focus on those dark squares. But again, I was a little nervous about opening up my king, and I decided to go safety first, queen at e1. Which, yeah, objectively is a mistake, but I do still have an advantage. And his response, bishop f6, wasn't that great either. I'm not sure why I played knight d3 and not knight at g4. I mean, I'm learning actually quite a bit just from looking at the game, realizing that when they play h6, I should put my knight on g4 and sack on h6. That's kind of an instructive learning point for me, absolutely. I mean, if they take it, just kind of helps me jump something on f6 at the right moment, so that's not really an answer for black either. Yeah, knight d3, I was being a little too, cautious, bit too maneuvering. Probably one reason I was doing this because I knew I was moving generally faster than my opponent in previous games. So I was focusing on this approach of well, let's just play solidly, just slowly improve the position, and kind of let his time run down a bit and then make the strike. And while, of course, maybe this is not the approach I'd say to get to a 3000 rating, but it kind of worked out okay in this game. So knight g4, he goes knight at c4. Yeah, I was kind of expecting maybe to move the bishop or put a knight at f5. That's sort of what I was thinking as perhaps a better way. You should try to cover the dark squares up against the coming attack. I think, I was just so shocked about him, leaving this on. I think it almost was like a bluff where I was like, oh, it's hard to explain, actually. Maybe I just had a lapse in concentration because I'm, kind of shocked I didn't just take and, just drop the pawn to just win because it looks so obvious now in hindsight. Maybe I hallucinated he was getting a pawn on d2. It's hard to explain otherwise, but anyway, f3, luckily, even though this approach is not the best one, it still does give me, I think, a winning position with best play. After take, I mean, I've got ideas of e5 and putting a pawn f6. This is why I played this. I'm not sure if he should have played d4, because I think that is a bit of a strategic mistake, give me a pawn in hand. But he wants to go f3 and he wants to change the trend of the game, and it doesn't really succeed because in such a closed position, the knight and pawn is worth way more than the rook. In fact, even a knight by itself is probably worth more than the rook, but where are you going to drop the rook here if you're black? I think he kind of realized, if I get in pawn at e5, pawn at f6, take on f6, h6, that he's just getting murdered on the dark squares. This is why I kind of went into swindle mode, and this is also why I went for a very safety-first approach. Maybe a little bit too much, but anyway, after pawn f5, fg7, I mean, at this point, I'm pretty sure that there is probably some force mate or very close to it. Well, I played bishop takes h6, and just kind of decided not to, spend ages calculating, looking for the forced mate. Turns out pawn f6 is the key, that queen at f6, knight h7 is a very nice tactic that I did not really see, or honestly didn't even really look for in the game. But I decided just to take and just keep this sort of initiative. I'm not really given the time to drop the piece he needs to. Admittedly, I was a little bit careless. H takes g4 is very, very careless. I should just take the queen because I'm threatening queen e7 and queen takes c7, which was not something that I realized during the game. And h4, and I was like, oh no, he has knight h3, but luckily for me, it doesn't lead anywhere. My king is so safe from before that I could make one oversight and still keep my king safe, which of course is not the case here. He makes one oversight and suddenly his king is almost getting mated. So we have these moves where kind of, I'm not sure if I defend in the very best way, but it ended up being enough in the end. Actually, it turns out I have a forced mate with pawn at d7 followed by pawn at b7. I'd probably go knight at c5 or something like this. But and I figured, well, I don't think there's anything wrong with taking the queen, so I just took the queen and just was practical, figuring, okay, with the queen in hand, there's going to be some mate at some point. And indeed, at this point, when Nancy takes the queen, this is where I realized, okay, it's 21 seconds, 11 seconds, but let's not be lazy. Let's actually figure out the mate. Actually, it turns out knight at d6 and pawn at d7 are technically the fastest mates. I think the idea being that, you can't take because queen at c7 mate, but if king d8, you have queen at f6, and you're basically able to go for a really nice smothered mate, actually, with rook at c8. And okay, it's really nice, but also I think it's not really our job, let's say, in a bullet game to calculate this if, let's say, there are other simpler ways to win. I think it's okay if I just keep dropping pieces with check. That's going to make sure that I end up winning it. And again, rook at d7, queen f8, knight takes f7 is mate and free. But I put the knight here figuring, okay, this has got to be mate somehow with so many pieces in hand. Indeed, king d7, knight e5, and drop a queen on d7 is easy enough. King e5, bishop d4. But after king c8, I missed some fast mates like bishop at a6 and then queen at d8 stuff. But I figured pawn at b7, I just saw the idea of getting the knight in, and I figured that's got to be good enough. Once I saw a clearly winning line, I didn't really look further. If king c8, I probably would have just gone pawn at b7, which, again, not the fastest way to mate, but it means you'll be able to promote with a check and get the material you need one way or the other. Anyway, after king c6, I missed queen b5 mate, but I saw, pawn at b5, and again, when you see a mate, you just play it rather than, wasting time thinking about other stuff. And yeah, that was a game that got me over to 700. And after being this guy one more time, I basically got my current Crazyhouse rating of 2704. Well, this is current at the time of recording. Maybe I will have played some more games by the time this video is uploaded and you're watching it. But anyway, thanks for your attention. Great to see that you made it to the end. And I really believe that by seeing how top Crazyhouse players think and approach that the game and the different positions, that it's going to make it much easier for you. When I see about Crazyhouse, that even though there is, of course, a lot more legal possibilities with drops on the board, I find that the number of patterns you need to master it is actually quite a bit less than in normal, let's say, classical chess. And so that's something that's very encouraging as well. Like once you see a certain number of patterns and you've kind of seen them all already, and then it's just a matter of basically making them automatic. And once you do that, I mean, you can beat anybody in Crazyhouse, especially if you have the white pieces, because, well, I mean, when you're playing with black, I mean, in these games I was able to overcome those challenges, but it took me a very long time to get to that stage where I learned how to create those practical chances with black and to defend very well, because it's quite a rare skill, and it took me also quite a bit of time to master. And yeah, that's basically the story of how I got to 700, and I think that in terms of getting to 800, I think a lot of it's just going to be kind of consolidating these points here, and probably also like going deeper, not just into the wide openings. I did play through a lot of games by Blitz Bullet in the white side of Catalan to really get good and comfortable with the positions. And definitely should do something similar with the black opening, seeing how players like, Katask, Jasugi, Janley, Opawes, how these like greats of Crazyhouse, approach these different openings that they play, and, the ones that sort of suit my style as well. That's probably the sort of key shift to really just play through a lot more high-level games and complement it with things like, analyzing my own games, learning the right lessons from there. I know I've definitely learned a lot from doing this, because I don't normally analyze my Crazyhouse games afterwards, but this was, I think, a fun thing and something I look forward to doing more often. So on that note, I will see you guys in the next video, and until then, best of luck in your Crazyhouse games.